I said, where you're from, where you're working at, and what are your highlights from the conference so far. And like I said, while we're waiting for that speaker to come on, I'll do a little intro about myself, and then I will turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. So like I said, my name is Chanel Fletcher, Deputy Executive Officer of Environmental Justice for the California Air Resources Board. In that role, I'm really looking at how we at the California Air Resources Board are addressing environmental justice and advancing racial equity in all that we are doing. And I think for those who may not know, the California Air Resources Board, also known as CARB, we're really looking at kind of like the oversight for air pollution and climate change within California. And those, I think, and in that realm, particularly around transportation, really focused, hyper focused on accelerating electrification of vehicles in California and really thinking about how we're doing that through the lens of environmental justice and racial equity and how we're prioritizing low-income communities, BIPOC communities, and really thinking about some of those issues around access, affordability, charging infrastructure, and thinking about, I think, the ways in which historic inequities have created those burdens and how do we address those. And when I say electrification, I should be clear that it's electrification of the fleet, right? So we're not just thinking about vehicles, we're thinking about trucks, we're thinking about transportation in general, and how we do that in a way, again, that's equitable and that's reducing air pollution and emissions. So that's kind of my kind of intro, my reason why of being here. I think obviously with an e-mobility, diversity, equity, and inclusion conference, I think we are excited to be here. We're excited to be part of this panel and help to moderate. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel first to give a kind of a brief introduction and share a little bit more about why she's here. And Rachel, if you're talking, you're on mute. Oh no, I think you're still can't hear you. Okay, maybe we'll go to Merchan first, and then we'll come back to Rachel.
Hi, my name is Merchan Green. I am the equity official for the city of Orlando. My position came about after 14 days of protest after the murder of George Floyd last year. And residents took to City Hall. Mayor Dyer and the council heard the residents' concerns and felt that it was extremely important to create a position that looked through the lens of equity to review the program's policies, services, and processes that the city had in place. Interesting enough, I did not know when applying for this position that it came about after after the murder of George Floyd and protest. I just saw like the job description, and I was currently working in that environment, doing those things. And so I was like, oh, this is perfect for me. You know, I have a passion for equity and I'm currently working in equity. So I applied for the position. After being hired, I learned that it came from the protest of George Floyd, which aligned with my life experiences. My family had our own George Floyd in 2007. My uncle, who was mentally ill, was off his medication. My grandmother called to the Indian River Sheriff's Department asking for an officer to assist him with getting his medication. And by the end of the interaction, my uncle was killed. And so just with my experiences, being able to relate to those who actually was advocating for a more in-depth and intentional look into equity within the city, I feel that it was like by divine intervention that I am in this position. And I'm just excited to be a part of the city because the city of Orlando has done a lot when it comes to being ahead of the curve and being inclusive. So excited about that. And then I'm on this panel today because with the e-mobility opportunities that are arising, it is extremely important that equity is embedded in the process and that all citizens and residents are being considered. So that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing and for being so vulnerable. Like, I really appreciate that. And I think it's always helpful to hear how we're coming into this work. Rachel, I see that you're back on, so I'll go to you.
Great, thank you. I think I finally figured out what was wrong. So Thanks so much. So good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Sakata, and I'm a Senior Air Quality Planner here at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. And I basically work on advancing zero-emission vehicle adoption for passenger cars and trucks, medium and heavy-duty vehicles, through both the regulatory and incentive-based programs. I'm also the program manager for the Oregon Clean Vehicle Rebate Program, which offer rebates towards the purchase or lease of an electric vehicle or motorcycle. And so, our program is a key component in getting people into electric vehicles. One of the things that we're most proud of with this rebate program is that we offer this charge ahead rebate, which is basically for low and moderate income residents who purchase or lease a new or used EV. And it's really a great opportunity to help get these low to moderate income households to help make EV purchase more achievable. And so with the influx of the incoming grant dollars for infrastructure build out, this provides even more opportunity to really be able to ensure that there's adequate charging infrastructure in communities where public charging may not be currently accessible, how to make charging available at multi-unit dwellings, and even looking at ways to help subsidize not only the vehicle purchase, but also charging for these low-income communities. We recognize that vehicles are not the only mode of transportation. And so, one other option, is I think we've mentioned a little bit, is, to explore whether to expand incentives to other electric modes of transportation, including e-bikes and scooters, and the charging to help support it. So I'm really excited to be part of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, so much. And Alan, I will turn to you.
And I'm Alan Harned. Sorry, I logged in twice, and so I caused so much trouble. So I don't follow the rules, and that's maybe what we need. Is we need to kind of rewrite our rules to help all people. I'm the director of the Virginia Clean Cities Coalition, representing an example of kind of an on the ground coalition of folks who are working on mobility issues, on cleaner air. At the fleet level, but also at consumer level, and Virginia Clean Cities is one of 75 U.S. Department of Energy Clean Cities coalitions. We take diversity, equity, and inclusion as a cornerstone of our efforts and our programs to ensure that we are getting clean air to the folks who need it most, and clean air technologies to all people. And in the past, there have been some programs that maybe build chargers or get vehicles out to early adopters. That's great, that set the model. But sometimes the early adopters are those who have the greatest amount of resources, and it does become an equity fail. I'm also the Climate and Environmental Justice Chair for my local NAACP. So we're working to advance, in my case, early adoption or zero emission vehicles in Virginia and regionally. And we're working with now 18 states on drive electric programs and several mid-Atlantic efforts. And I just want to appreciate EV Noir. They are our education lead for our regional ecosystem project. And so we worked to put them front and center, to put these programs front and center, which is one of 3 National Department of Energy ecosystem building efforts. And so hopefully these can be models. We're also planning electric vehicle incentives, which would have an enhanced equitable emphasis, not using income as a barrier, but instead using income and other categories as a way to provide emphasis and far more resources for more technology support where it's needed. And I'm just grateful to be here.
Awesome. And so I think I love doing introductions at the beginning because I think it's so important for all of us to kind of see how we're coming into the work, what shaped us and what's molded us, especially as we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and e-mobility. So I want to encourage people, keep chiming in the chat. If there's something that somebody says that you were going to react to, please, please, please use the chat as a way to kind of keep the conversation going as we're talking. I'll also try to be tracking questions so people can put questions in the Q&A. That would be really helpful on my end. But like I said, I'll be tracking the chat. So please do keep using that as a feature to kind of react to what we're talking about. I will say that in terms of this panel, what we're talking about, we're really looking at those federal funding streams, right? And so I think if we've been kind of watching what's happening and what's seeing going on, right? For example, we just saw that huge kind of infrastructure package actually kind of get those votes. So we know that money is going to be coming in to cities and states from the federal level for e-mobility investments. And so I think there's really a critical point, and part of why I think we have this amazing panel here today is to start thinking about, so we're going to have these questions around these funds, what are we prioritizing and how are we implementing equitable programs? What does it look like to have an equity lens on the funding that's coming in? How do we not replicate the kind of the same pitfalls that we've already seen? How do we do kind of more transformative equity work with these funds? I think these are big questions. And so I think with this panel, we're really looking to kind of get a sense of like, what are some of the best practices that you've already seen, that you've kind of helped develop, that you've helped shape? Just from your own experience, where are places that we need to learn, like, whoa, we need to avoid this. We don't want to do this. We don't want to see this happen again. And I think, Alan, to your point, right? Like, where are the places where we do actually need to start breaking some of the rules so we can get to, I think, some of the goals that we want to see around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's kind of in a snapshot what we're going to be discussing today. As I shared with our panelists, I'll be asking, a couple of questions, and I will be trying to monitor both the chat and the QA. So I think we can kind of get a good, robust discussion from, I think, folks that are watching us, and as well as thinking of those questions and making sure that I think you're getting the information that you need to help shape the programs that you're working on. So I'll start with a big question for folks. And I think this can be, you could take this, I think, for your own kind of like, work within your cities, or you can even take it larger than that and think about just a general answer. But one of the questions that I'm really curious about is, how prepared do you feel cities are and states are to actually utilize the incoming funding? So again, I think I referenced the bipartisan infrastructure package that just passed, and then this discussions around the Build, Back Better agenda. We're pretty clear. It's pretty clear that we're going to get these large sums of money that are going to come down, hopefully, for e-mobility infrastructure. So just really curious, what are you feeling like the level of preparedness for cities and states are to actually utilize these funds, particularly with that kind of emphasis on equity? And I think anyone can jump in and answer.
Well, for the city of Orlando, I'll say that we're extremely prepared. In 2021, earlier this year, we started, we actually worked with EV Hybrid Newer to start a e-mobility task force. And we recently had our EV readiness code passed by our council, which will be implemented in January. And we've also been working with communities, right? So working with the community and community organizations and transit companies, as well as our local and county government, to really just discuss what mobility should look like from now. Our goal is 2030. So we do have a vision statement, which I'll read because I brought it up just to share. So basically, our vision is we aim to create mobility opportunities that embrace emerging technologies, reduce emissions that harm public health, bolster climate change resilience, and increase access and affordability for our disadvantaged communities. And we've already kind of figured out what we want to do with the funds that are coming. We're looking to create some type of rebate program. So for those who can't afford some of the costs that is going to be required to be for the transition, we'll be putting that in place. So just really looking to eliminate barriers. So what you were asking earlier about what not to look at, I would say like our past transportation system, it has a lot of inequity. So it's something that we can look and say, okay, where are the barriers? Where are the deficiencies in this system? And then with mobility, now e-mobility, we have an opportunity to kind of reconstruct what didn't work. And so that's what we've really been trying to consider, like how can we make equity foundational? So not just in us saying, oh, these are the barriers, but actually engaging the people who are affected by these things, the folks that will be using it, and doing it on a level, not just corporations, but small business. So really just having that diverse community input.
And I think that folks have been, sometimes I describe it as scratching in the dirt, but folks have been doing some attempted planning for 10 years. So there's so many dreams and so many opportunities out here. Plans for the full build out and to really service all people will cost many more billions locally. And some states are getting maybe 50 million to 100 million. And so there's going to be a lot of real need for some soul searching in the process to ensure that states are getting the, I think you talked about it, being sure that the money is grounded, or that the programs are grounded in equity. They're grounded in getting real results for a wide range of people, because you could slap up $50 million with just a few sites if they're big enough, and that could be real problematic. And so I would just flag that folks have sort of been planning this for 10 years. There are 5 years worth of sort of state programs so that they can be stepped. Then there will be more chances for community engagement and analysis and looping in. And it's so great that there is also a competitive program, that there's a program where communities can submit their own concepts up. States and communities can be eligible. And so that local planning really does lead to great success. But there needs to be a few more tools, and there does need to be some standard centering on equity that can be adopted, and a real public shakeout of that analysis, because just sort of shouting it is one thing, but having a truly vetted political process could be very helpful.
Great. And I'll just say, here in Oregon, I think we're ready for it. Our Department of Transportation is gearing up for it. We're lucky in that, we have a governor that supports transportation electrification and has set goals, to have at least 250,000 registered EVs by 2025. We currently have a multi-agency working group with our Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, Department of Administrative Services, our Public Utilities Commission, and then us, the DEQ, to really figure out how we can advance the electrification of vehicles. And, the beauty of it is we're able to work together to help build and expand e-mobility options, whether through complementary policies, cross-program coordination, or even potential pilot programs. We can look at how, for example, we might be able to coordinate vehicle rebates, linkage to ensuring that there's adequate public and private charging, especially in areas where we know that there might be disadvantaged communities or communities in need, and making sure that all Oregonians can have access to equitable charging.
Great, and I think I just wanted to follow up on a couple of things that I heard, because it sounds like we're all kind of saying, like, or at least what I'm hearing is like, yes, like cities are prepared, we're ready, we've been thinking about this. So I am really curious, are there like specific pilots or programs that you've done that you would want to elevate or highlight? And I think about that because I think, Alan, you had mentioned like there are more tools that we need to see, right? So like, is there kind of any like programs or communities that you've worked with where you're like, here are the tools that we need to see? I see you're ready for that one. And I think the other point, like Sean, you mentioned this around like we've got to learn from what we've done previously in terms of previous infrastructure packages. But for you, Rachel, I'm curious, and this is again for the entire panel, I'm curious, what are the ways in which, in your cities, you've said like, we saw this happen last time, we're now prepared, and here's what we want to see differently, or here's what we're doing, and maybe it's working with communities, whatever that is. Like, what is that different thing? So it was 2 questions. I think, like I said, 2 questions, but I think anyone can tackle either one of those.
I'm just going to say how much I appreciate getting to work with the tools that are offered that are free and accessible nationwide. Things like tools from the national labs, and so things like the energy zone mapping tool is one that is being flooded with additional maps and resources for analysis. So it's an early start process, but there'll need to be reports back. And my point would be, we talked about past projects, and this might be getting into another person, but there've been so many past projects over the last 10 years. You can sort of look at them and see what they did and see how many equity boxes were properly checked off by looking at them. There's the EPA EJ scan tool, and there's the national labs have another more urbanized focused tool, which is the EVI Pro Tool Lite. But my pitch would be for tools that are freely accessible nationwide, and that all can use. And so in even making those tools more robust and more accessible. In the Southeast states, they've also done some additional tools, and it'd be just great for these to have access to more states or more regions, so that folks can look locally in their own neighborhoods even and compare data reasonably. There's a full public database of all the stations, for example. And so you can see when the stations came online, what type of station those are, what type of network they are. You can identify what projects did what. And we should all be, especially when using any public funds, we should all be very eager to share those results and have those results vetted in the public eye. And I'll put some links in the chat.
Awesome. That was one of the questions that we just got right there was, can you drop some of those tools that you're mentioning in the chat? So that would be awesome. Rashawn and Rachel, I want to give you guys a chance to chime in or respond or share any thoughts that you have too.
What was your second question?
Right, I do that a lot. So yeah, the second question was really thinking about, because I think you had brought up, what we want to avoid is what we've done previously, right? So I think for me, I'm thinking about, we've had, infrastructure packages in the past. I think you had talked about even how our transportation system was set up originally, right? It was like perpetuating inequities. So I'm really curious when we're thinking about the planning that we're doing and kind of like being prepared, like what are we doing now to kind of shift, right? To shift away from building on those inequities. And are there specific kind of like programs or pilots that you'd say, like, here's one example where it's like, we're not going to kind of replicate those previous inequities?
So I'll just speak to what the city of Orlando is doing. So basically, as I stated earlier, we had a diverse pool of community partners that we partner with in order to hear from the community. But then we also developed a equity roadmap, an e-mobility roadmap. And with that, just went deep into like defining what e-mobility means to us, looking at the different advantages, disadvantages, discussing equity so that everyone understands what that looks like and what it means, and then going a little deeper, because when you start engaging communities that are underserved, underrepresented, they don't have the flexibility or the time to come back to you 2 and 3 times and give you information as you hone it. So you have to ensure that like each touch is very impactful and goes deep enough to get the information that you need. So in that aspect, that's what we've done that's a little different. We've also put out about, I want to say it's 100 new EV charging stations across the city of Orlando. We focused on our parks, our neighborhood centers, and our public venues and parking garages. We looked to areas to be intentional and focused on equitable distribution and stations that not just where like most EV adoption is occurring, but looking like, okay, so where can we reach the most people and make it the most convenient? So we've tried to take it a step further than just, okay, here's where we typically have this, but looking at different things. And we're also looking at like EV sharing, not just single e-mobility, but more other options in case like there are barriers with financial barriers, because we know that they will exist.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say from Oregon, I think, what's different, or what's sort of the way we look at things now, is that, we're really committed to ensuring that we advance equitable outcomes for communities in Oregon. We have some other efforts, underway. For example, we have our Every Mile Counts effort, which is, sort of a separate multi-agency approach for how to reduce greenhouse gas and implement our statewide transportation strategy. And through this, we've hosted a series of equity engagement workshops to really gather input and guidance from equity and climate justice stakeholders. And it really, helped us listen and understand the needs and the priorities of diverse communities, to really, build upon past conversations and relationships between agencies and stakeholders, and, provide kind of that foundational information to where we can identify equity-focused principles and outcomes that can be applied to sort of future actions. And so there's a number of things underway as we look at how to distribute some of this federal funding. Looking, as Alan mentioned, there's a lot of tools out there. We're also looking at, how can we address equity mapping, locations on where we can focus charging, looking at multi-unit dwellings, versus single-family homes, making sure there's adequate access to public charging, especially in the rural areas of Oregon, because once you get outside sort of our I-5 corridor, it's many miles between cities. And so, how else do you address that?
I think those are such big, important questions. And I think when everyone was sharing, it was triggering me to think about, I think, for example, at CARB, in the same vein, right? We're taking, I think, some of the state funds that we're getting and the federal funds that we're thinking about how do we design programs with, I think, with communities in mind. And I think, Marshawn, to your point, right? Like, and creating a space where we're not constantly like going back and back and back, right? And kind of exhausting and tapping people out, but really thinking about how can we bring you in at the ground level to basically shape and drive this fund so that they're really addressing community needs, right? And so I think we have a thing called, for example, we have the STEP program, which is like sustainable transportation, equity project, and it's really focusing very locally, very much on like how do we identify for California these disadvantaged communities, and then how do we partner with community organizations, with local governments to really address those very localized transportation needs. But I do think one of the things that do come up, right, is that charging infrastructure. And so if we're accelerating electrification, how are we also accelerating and working on that charging infrastructure, especially in, I think, those rural areas of California too. So that it resonated with me in thinking about we're kind of trying to design these programs to be more flexible with funds, more community driven and focused. And I think there's also a question of like, how do we make sure we're matching up with that electrification goal with the infrastructure as well. With that said, I'm going to turn over to the Q&A. So thank you folks for using the Q&A to put those questions in, and keep using the chat as well to respond and react to things and ask for things that you need. One question that came up, and this is from Nancy. So the question is, I appreciate the Justice 40 program, right? So this is the federal kind of Justice 40 program, but I am wondering whether this may result in 60% of funding going to well-off communities. So the question is, will all the funding be distributed with a lens of equity? I don't know if folks can answer that specific question, but I think if you have any thoughts on, I think, what Nancy is kind of bringing up on that point of that Justice 40 and that lens on like equity around the transportation funding, definitely want to open up for people to respond to.
And I would just respond that it's probably worth taking a deep look at how states are running these programs now, or how they were running them a few years ago. A lot of grants and federal support takes, it's like a reimbursement-based process, which means that these communities have to outlay a huge amount of money first before they can get money back. And there's only maybe 30 days sometimes to respond. And then further, these grants and programs regularly require cost share at a very high level. And so I think a lot of the past programs would accrue not only to the wealthy communities, but they certainly do have the ability to respond to the grant funding asks, and then to get their board to sign off, or get their local governments to get that, or maybe local governments have a staffer who is a sustainability and grant writer on staff. And so the Justice 40 is a massive step forward. And it might not be perfect or instantly perfect. It is a pilot, but I would hope it can be a major step forward. You can look at the press releases for what projects get funded, and sometimes all the resources in a state like Virginia that has 133 localities, sometimes $10 million worth of whole state program resources will go to a single locality. And there's opportunities for far more access to this funding.
Thanks, Alan. Anyone else want to respond to that? All right, I'm going to keep us on federal funds with another question from Rachel. So for federal funds, applicants must comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 or refund the monies. It's a provocative question. So some EV advocating organizations flout noncompliance. How do you protect civil rights? So I think I might say, again, like, it's a big question. So I think in some of the programs and the pilots that we're discussing, very curious on how we're making sure that we're protecting the civil rights, and really thinking about ADA, for example, and making sure that we're in compliance as we're kind of thinking about this infrastructure, electrification, et cetera.
Right. So, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think more than anything, we've seen here in Oregon, we try and work very closely with, community organizations, local leaders, to sort of, ensure that the needs are being met, that we're able to, get the funding to the appropriate organizations and ensuring that we can sort of address sort of the needs of the community. We, as I've mentioned, we have our rebate program where we're trying to focus on low and moderate income households. We're definitely aware of some of the challenges and the barriers there. One of which is, we have rebates that we recognize that the upfront costs can be barriers for low and moderate income households, and so we're looking at ways to sort of minimize those barriers through allowing pre-qualification of rebates so that those rebates can be applied at the time of sale. Things like that, working with local communities and organizations to sort of help get the information out, and ensuring that any funding that does get allocated meet sort of our overall equity and EJ sort of needs.
And I would emphasize how important ADA and a number of other federal cross-cutting requirements are. There's been style guides that folks have been publishing for at least 10 years on electric vehicle chargers. We've got some on our website, but we worked with many states in that development, and it's also baked into the permit process to ensure chargers are there. There have been projects where we've gone back and ripped out the equipment to redo it to ensure that it provides equitable access, and specifically ADA. You also don't want, if you're installing one charger, maybe with a $50,000 in community dollars, you don't want it to be blocked off and prohibited from use in public. You want to use a style that would allow folks with disabilities to use it, but would also allow it to be accessible to other members of the public as well. And so there is a kind of a fluid need here, especially if it's like the first charger or the only charger in communities. And so there are some standards, and it's something that really should be part of the dialogue. And things like that are requirements for federal things, this or Buy America, or Davis-Bacon, which would be fair wage provisions. Buy America is American products, and in some cases agencies misinterpret that and require all the steel to be 100% American. That sort of prohibits any of the work from getting done. These cross-cutting requirements are very important, and I would hope collaboration and planning could allow people to achieve them, not to skirt them.
Okay, I'm gonna switch us up a little bit. There's a really good question around pandemic funding, but I want to go back to local communities. But I think we're gonna get back to that one. So it's almost like a two-part question, but they're both focused on local communities with needs. So I think one is like, how can local communities who have needs, right? So they have the need, it's very clear, it's documented, but not the TE charging kind of shovel-ready projects, ensure the money flows to them. So when they do have those projects, right, they know they'll be funded. So I think, again, kind of like from your experience and what you're working with right now, like how are you making sure that those communities that maybe they're not shovel ready yet, but they have those needs, how are we making sure that we're kind of making sure that they're getting those funding so when they're ready to go, those projects can move quickly?
So I would say that representation is very important, and just really communicating with the government. So my history comes from like community organizing, and one of the things I did was create a nonprofit that taught citizens how to engage with their representatives, how to get involved on governmental committees, and just represent themselves. So with this, I would say you reach out to whoever is over this in your city government, whether it's local or county, state, and make it known, and also find out like how you could actually work with the city or the county or state in the state level to make sure that when the funds do come available, like your community has a voice. A lot of times those in those positions, they may not have the contacts or even know who to communicate with in order to be in touch with that community, and just contacting them kind of lets them know like, hey, you have someone here that cares about this work and is willing to assist you and give feedback. And you'd be surprised on how much progress can be made and how often you'll be contacted to give your input on things that affect your community. So definitely don't hesitate to reach out to not only your elected officials, but those staffers that are working in that area that you have a concern.
Yeah, and just to follow up on what Rashawn was saying, I think it's definitely, reaching out to partner agencies or other communities to sort of let them know about it. I mean, we're fortunate here in Oregon in that we have the Clean Fuels program. And so if there are communities that sort of are interested in doing something, they might be able to partner with their local utility, because then the utility may be generating credits through our low carbon fuels program, to which they can monetize to maybe help sort of pilot a little mini project for that community to kind of try it out and see if it'll work. So then, when there is more funding available, then they can kind of point to that and say, look, we were able to kind of just do this little mini opportunity here, and we can definitely scale it up and expand it at this point. So, so I think it's definitely kind of reaching out within the different networks to say, hey, we have some ideas, we have some opportunities, let's see how we can make this work.
Definitely agree. And I think I would say for CARB, just chiming in very quickly, one of the things that we do on this end is we have funds specifically for planning, right? So there's some grants that are specifically for implementation, right? So if you have those projects, they're ready to go, we can fund those kind of projects through implementation. But we do have some projects that are or some grants that are just meant for planning. And so I think, for example, if you don't have that shovel-ready project, you can get the funding to start to plan out and think about, like, well, what is this going to look like? How do we develop it? How do we make sure that we have the tools that we need? And then I think with that two-step process, it's like there's a planning grant and there's an implementation grant. And so you can, I think, use that way as another way just to kind of make sure that you're getting the funding to those communities to make sure they have the plans in place so that they can move forward with that implementation. I think this question to me follows up really nicely. And again, it's really kind of focusing on local communities. Inner city dwelling inhabitants do not always have the financial resources to purchase AVs. So are they not left behind? I think that the question here to me is like, in what ways could this, fund allocation and investment reach them? Where is the equity in the budgeting and the spending? And so I think I would ask again, panelists, like if we're looking at those programs that you're developing and creating, how are we thinking about and prioritizing those who do not have those financial resources?
Well, I would flag that these types of infrastructure bills are going to come with not just like a single electric vehicle infrastructure fund, but all these community programs. There's going to be, in Build Back Better, there'll be block grants for renewable energy efficiency. In the infrastructure bill, there's a massive amount of funding for transit and for road improvements. And so folks are still going to get around with, bike, pedestrian, micro mobility, and transit solutions. And so it's all part of the same thing. And so those, for Virginia, so there's bridge money and there's sustainable transportation. We're going to receive $1.2 billion in our public transportation funding in Virginia with the act, for example, which is about 10 times more than the $106 million that's being received for EV chargers. And so these are all going to work together, and some of the transit buses will also be electrified. There's another nationwide electric transportation program for that. But the road money also includes a focus on cyclists and pedestrians in the federal fund that's coming down. And so these communities, it's a matter of telling your story, tracking down your goals, and communicating that up. Road money is totally political money. That is money that's driven by local priorities. And so if the priority is cyclists, pedestrians, and all users, you can communicate that. Virginia is going to get $7 billion from that program. $7 billion for roads, $1 billion for transit, and $100 million for electrification. So really, there's going to be a lot in these federal programs for different modes of clean transportation.
Awesome. Okay. Let's go. So this one I wanted to come back to it because I didn't forget it, Andy. So one of the lessons, I think we talked about like what we can learn from, right, and what we can avoid. So what are the lessons that states and cities should learn from the hectic disbursement of federal pandemic funding, right? So for example, like rental assistance, for getting infrastructure monies out of the door. So I think is there any lessons that you would learn from as we watch kind of pandemic inflow, lots of money flowing out. What can we learn from that and use to better, I think, disperse, move forward with the infrastructure funds that are coming?
I would say be better prepared and set up a system, and with this system, again, making equity the foundation, right? Like making sure that we are extremely intentional with targeting those low income areas, the areas where we know that financial burdens will exist or there's some type of barriers to exist. So that would basically be my suggestion, just making sure that there's a system already in place, that you have the manpower, because we saw in Florida that there was a number of times where funding was with an organization, but they didn't really have the manpower to distribute it. And so funding was held up. So just really preparing that infrastructure and making sure that we are prepared and have looked at barriers and considered kind of like where we may have some similar issues and working that out prior to getting the funds.
Right, and I think part of it too is, if you can, is sort of trying to develop that criteria now for how, we'll be able to distribute that funding, getting those systems in place ready to go. So then, when the funding comes, then we can say, all right, we've already had the opportunity to work with stakeholders and, and identify, where are the areas that are most in need. So then we're able to begin, either through a grant process or what have you, or working with other communities to help them apply for the grant, for that matter, to really get that moving quickly. Because as you know, anything with the federal government just takes a long time. So as much as local communities and states can, start now, I think it'll just help us in the long run.
I think that definitely, to me, that is like one of the biggest lessons learned, right? Is like, how do we use the pandemic and that experience to start planning better, I think, how we're dispersing funds, how we're setting up and resourcing exactly to, I think, do what we want to do, right? So it's almost like a lesson learned process. We're going to switch over to states, right? So looking at state, one question is, how are cities and states thinking about metrics to measure the benefits to underserved communities? And that's both in terms of like the investment and for like electric vehicle supply equipment siting. So what are some of the metrics, whether it's your state, whether it's your city, that you're using right now to kind of measure and assess those benefits to underserved communities?
Sure. So I can just speak a little bit with regards to, as I mentioned, I manage the rebate program. So one of the things that we have set forth is, that at least 20% of our overall rebate funding goes towards the low and moderate income households and communities. I like to say that that is a floor, not a ceiling. I would, love to see even more participation and engagement on that level. And so part of that is, making sure that we're able to connect with these communities. It's more than just sort of letting people know about it. It's sort of engaging with community groups, church groups, things like that, getting trusted leaders within the community to really be able to message, what are electric vehicles, what are they about, hey, by the way, did you know there's a rebate and how this can be applied, looking at other ways that we can help them with financing upfront, because we realize that can also be a barrier as well. We're looking at a number of different tools to kind of, figure out how we can sort of increase like our overall participation and ensure that we're meeting our overall goals of, getting electric vehicles into the hands of as many people as possible. And, we also recognize that there are other barriers too, just with charging. And so we're working closely with Department of Transportation, to figure out how we can ensure that there's adequate access to public charging in areas where, there may not be a lot of single family homes. How can we ensure that multi-unit dwelling owners and can ensure that there are, charging being installed, or even with new developments, especially for low-income new developments, ensuring that the areas are built out and ready to have charging already applied. So there's a number of things that we're sort of looking at here in the state.
And there are a number of different community maps and community software. I think I mentioned that some EPA tools, but one of the major challenges is a lot of these programs for clean air or clean transportation pride themselves on declining administrative funds or no administrative funds or no tracking. And that creates a really phenomenal information gap for exactly this type of self-reflection or review. You'd want to know the type of infrastructure, the speed of the infrastructure, and also the cost of infrastructure. For years, the only nationwide technology deployment program for chargers was that Tesla was giving away free chargers. So like after the Recovery Act, there was a gap of about 8 years where almost nothing happened until the Volkswagen settlement. And so there's a number of free public level 2 chargers in Tesla communities. But where are the chargers being built now with the public funds? What neighborhoods? And then also when you're talking about vehicles, you could look at e-bike or electric vehicle with enhanced rebates that track people's income. You could have that information. But again, you want to treat it all super securely. The administrators need a whole bunch of extra resources to track that appropriately, to know what they're tracking, and to do it. And I will just say that it's not done well yet.
So
yeah, go for it.
So for the state of Florida, we have 2 plans basically that we looked at, and the first one is the Department of Transportation EV Master Plan, which was drafted this year, 2021, because the state legislation requires the Florida DOT to develop a master plan for expansion of electric vehicle charging station infrastructure along the state highway system, with the goals of supporting short range and long range electric vehicle travel, encouraging expansion of electric vehicle use in the state, and adequately serving evacuation routes throughout Florida. Then the second one is the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services Electric Vehicle Roadmap, which was created last year. And it's the first comprehensive investigation into the status and needs of EV charging infrastructure in the state. And it also provides us with a map which has recommended sites for charging infrastructure, as well as planning recommendations that address various topics such as permitting, emergency evacuation needs, and education. So we use those to kind of determine what our goals would be. And so City of Orlando, basically we have like goals that we want to reach by 2030, 100% of residents living within 10 minutes walk of a level 2 public charging station or a 10-minute drive. And then the proportion of e-mobility adoption throughout the city, we're hoping to have 100% disadvantaged communities are served by electric buses by 2030. So that's just 2 of them, but we have a number of data goals that we want to put measurable goals so that, nothing falls through the crack and you can look back and say, okay, well, we didn't meet the mark, but this is how we can improve.
And I'm nodding because I think in a similar vein, California, I mean, we have extremely ambitious kind of targets for electrification in California. And so part of that, we are working closely with the California Energy Commission to really start to map out and actually create a project and look at the data to think about what is the infrastructure needs for the state of California and how do we map that out and show that as transparently as possible, including the cost with consumers, because I think we realize, I think as we're all saying, right, like we've got to set those targets, and then we've got to have some way of tracking if we're doing it, because that creates that accountability. Otherwise, we're just setting targets and going nowhere. So I think I know we have a little less than 10 minutes left. One of the prep questions that I really did want to ask this group is that I think there's an inherent tension that I think I at least feel in our work at CAR, but I'm curious to kind of hear reactions on this. Authentic community engagement takes time, right? And I think that's something that we have learned, building relationships, creating trust, like addressing mistrust, like figuring out how to move forward through that all takes time. And then there's a lot of pressure, at least on our end, to once we get funding, to get it out quickly, get the program moving, show results, like, just show here's how we're moving this forward. Here's how we're, reducing, air pollution and reducing emissions. And it's just moving so quickly. I'm really curious, how are each of you kind of handling that tension? If you are feeling that tension, what does it look like to kind of like spend funds quickly, create programs quickly, while trying to do that authentic community engagement? And how are you making sure that those community engagements are actually shaping, I think, the programs the funding is going towards, which usually that funding has some strings on it too. So big question. Take any part of it that you'd like, but I'm very curious to hear about that from the panelists.
Sure. I mean, it is tough. I mean, I think we've all talked about this. We've definitely understand and appreciate the value and importance of engaging, ensuring that all members of the community are able to engage and have their voices heard. It does take time, but I think the state feels that that time spent in obtaining this input is valuable and provides a lot of good feedback on the development of programs and policies. I think one of the things is, if you're able to build upon existing programs, and hopefully with those programs you've had some level of community engagement, then it won't be as difficult to sort of quickly start them up and expand them. Standing up new programs obviously will require more time and engagement. But I think there is a lot of value added in making sure that you do that. You can start with sort of pilot programs in areas of identified need and sort of build out from there with the lens of full community engagement. So, I mean, I know there's sort of that tension there, but I mean, I think we've learned that there's really a lot of value to making sure that the community has had the opportunity for the input, and just understanding, what really are the needs, for them, and how can we structure it to make sure that it meets that.
I think that time is the big emphasis. Again, I just totally agree. Investing the time, going out to communities, so you can't rely on a survey mechanism or an email or a tweet from an agency, but it's actually going out to find the users at the stations or at the in the community centers, and listening, having open-ended questions rather than directed surveys. And that is all very hard. And then there's a push to spend money or to have everything shovel ready, and that brings people out that do not have something that's shovel ready, but that have a shovel ready story. And I think there's a whole lot to be said about going slow. In 5-year programs, spend one of the 5 and then reevaluate. And during that 5 years, you have plenty of opportunity to continually evaluate. And so incremental movement, rather than trying to blow it all on one contract that just will happen to hit your target dollar figure, gives you a chance. And then to go for the best projects that do provide that best value, the best connection back to the communities.
Okay, and I'm looking at time. I know we end at 10:45, so I think we have 4 minutes. So I think I want to give space for our panelists to kind of share out some kind of final kind of closing thoughts. And I think you guys can feel free to kind of skim the QA, because there's some questions that we just didn't have time to get to. But yeah, I would love to give you guys at least like a minute, to just kind of share out some of your closing thoughts on this kind of topic around, again, like the federal funding and the influx and how we kind of prioritize that.
So my closing thought would be for those watching, just encouraging them to get involved. As Rachel has stated earlier, even if you partner with a community organization that already is passionate about what you're passionate about, get involved, be vocal, interact with government, let us hear from you. You would be surprised at how much we are longing to connect with the community and get feedback, and that would really assist the process and making sure that systems are streamlined and more efficient and equitable. So that's my closing. Just get involved, please.
And I would probably echo Marshawn's statement too. I think, just from the state agency, we really value the input and engagement. We recognize that resources can be limited, and we value the time spent. It really helps us build better programs, ensure that what we have does meet the needs. And so I think overall it helps benefit everyone. So again, whether it's through community organizations or just other contacts, we encourage that any sort of engagement.
And I would say focus on the community partnerships, real partnerships of people who are pushing in a similar direction, by listening to them, and partner with. So you can accomplish so much more if you're sort of together on a bus that's moving forward. But you may have to say something 10 times for it to be heard the right way. So to continue to iterate on your message, to share your values. Ultimately, these projects are a story and a budget, and you can keep working to get to yes if you know what if you work to understand what your communities need.
Thank you all so much. I just want to say one, please know that like nobody here is like we're all gonna be at this conference. So there's other ways to interact. Like feel free to chat, feel free to like, like just reach out to people because there's so much good information that was shared today. And I think if there's follow-up questions, I want to encourage people to reach out and have those conversations. I think as Kirsten put in the chat already, there is a 15-minute break coming up. So everybody take care of yourself, enjoy yourself on that break. So you're welcome to join one of the 3 networking rooms or a one-on-one networking session. And then after that, there are going to be a panel sessions on, I think, transitioning transit, clean transportation on tribal lands, and autonomous vehicles, which is at 11 a.m. for me, because I'm on the West Coast, but 2 p.m. for those on the East Coast. And again, thank you all for joining us. And